Felt what?
Like you were jumping across time and space.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to logging in from wherever you are. We are here together, gathered together for the event Reimagining the Universe, South Korean Science Fiction Writers in Conversation. I'm Sunyoung Park. I teach Korean literature and culture at the University of Southern California. I'll be serving as moderator and interpreter for writers in today's event. I would like to thank our sponsors first. So Korean Literature Translation Institute of Korea, and the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and the Department of Gender Studies and Sexuality at USC. And also Kaya Press, whose chief editor, Sunyoung Lee, has made this event and the book we are featuring today possible with her labor of love. I also want to thank our organizers. The managing editor of Kaya, Neela Banerjee, organized this event, and Dylan Song and Mehdi Chang are behind the stage making this event possible. Also deserving to be mentioned is our art director, Chris Roh, and Derek Yang, who made this beautiful book trailer you just saw, and Kelly Mungyong Che, who designed the book cover for On the Origin of Species and Other Stories. So many of us have been hearing of these South Korean SF blockbusters. Yes, Bong Joon-ho's Snowpiercer, Okja, and the Host, but also Netflix original series, Sisyphus, and the Space Sweepers, the space opera, focusing on junk collectors. Now, these films didn't come out of nowhere. They grew out of a broader, older culture of science fiction in South Korea, of which few people outside Korea know because of the language difference. So Kaya Press has been trying to bring some of these works into English with the publication of Ready-Made Bodhisattva, the Kaya Anthology of South Korean Science Fiction in 2019, and this year with this volume, On the Origin of Species. In the meantime, more SF works have been making their way into English book market, like A Cursed Bunny. So today, we are bringing together Boyoung Kim, an established writer, and Bora Chung, Cursed Bunny, to take a fascinating look into this genre fiction scene of the country. And they will be joined by the translators and a discussant. I should note that we didn't have to scour through the South Korean science fiction world to find these two accomplished women writers. One characteristic of the countries SF scene compared with those of America, Europe, or other East Asian countries is that as much as 50% of the writers, of SF writers, are women. At today's event, we will first have Boyoung Kim read from The Origin of a Species with the other two, with two translators. And then Bora Chung will read from Cursed Bunny. Then we'll have a commentary from Seoyeon Lee, also from USC. And then finally, we'll open up to Q&A. And I invite you to submit your questions through the chatting window throughout this session, throughout the event. Now I will introduce the panelists of the first reading session. Dylan, can we have the book? Thank you. Anybody who has tried their hand at translation would know that translators' languages are as essential as the authors to make the literary work accessible in another language. On the Origin of Species is a fruit of collaborative labor of two accomplished translators. Jungmin Lee Comfort has received an award in 2017 from the American Literary Translators Association. She has published her works in Clark's World magazine, academic journals, and other children's books. Sora Kim Russell probably needs no introduction. She has brought to us a number of exciting mainstream and genre fiction literary works, such as Pyeonhae-young's The Hole and The City of Ash and Red, and Kim Un-soo's The Plotters. She has also taught translation workshop at Ewha Women's University and Literature Translation Institute of Korea. Finally, I introduce to you Boyoung Kim, aka the Queen of South Korean science fiction. I'm not exaggerating when I say that she is the most established woman SF writer today in South Korea. Through her excellent literary craftsmanship, her inventive and heartful imagination, and her outspoken advocacy of SF, Boyoung Kim has been an inspiration for a number of younger writers and her many devoted readers, among whom I count myself. I'm honored to present to you Boyoung Kim, who will first read from the title story on the origin of species.
Okay, now I start in Korean. 방 안은 하얀색의 조그만 단백질 뭉치로 채워져 있었다. 방 안에 열을 지어 늘어서 있는 조그만 그릇에 조그만 로봇 모양의 단백질들이 누워 있었다. K의 팔뚝보다 조금 작을까 말까한 크기로. 그리고 그 단백질들은 살아 있었다. K는 그릇마다 담겨있는 조그만 생물들을 넋을 잃고 바라보았다. 아, 그들은 끔찍하리만치 아름다웠다. 아직 채 자라지 않은 손가락과 발가락이 꼼지락거렸고 채 여물지 못한 몸이 아직 중력에 적응하지 못한 모양으로 몸을 가누기 위해 꼬물거리고 있었다. 그들은 완전했다. 마치 신이 만드신 것처럼. 카스트롭이 자신을 이곳으로 데려온 이유는 묻지 않아도 알 수 있었다. 세실이 보여준 한 명으로는 부족했다고 생각한 것이다. K는 몸을 가눌 수조차 없었다. 머릿속에서는 끊임없이 수백 마리의 악마가 도망쳐를 합창하고 있었다. 아직 이성이 남아있을 때 도망가야 한다. 그렇지 않으면 숫자가 너무 많아요. K는 현기증을 느끼며 간신히 입을 열었다. 왜 이렇게 많이 만든 거죠? 동물종은 상당한 양의 유기생물을 먹어치우는데 이 숫자를 어떻게 감당하려고요? 무슨 연구를 하고 있는 거예요? 연구라고? 무슨 말을 하는 건가? 연구라니. 카스트롭은 어이가 없다는 듯 말했다. K는 자신이 무슨 어이없는 말을 했는지 멍하게 생각했다. 한 명이라도 더 많이 태어나게 하고 싶을 뿐일세. 자네 말이 맞아. 감당할 수 있는 한도 내에서 해야겠지만 직원을 좀 더 늘리고 건물을 더 늘리면 가능할 것세. 왜죠? 왜냐니? 카스트롭은 아까의 연구원처럼 멍한 눈으로 되물었다. 안에 있는 연구원들도 이상하다는 눈으로 자신을 보고 있었다. 그제야 버려져 있던 자료실의 풍경이 떠올랐다. 유기학문은 퇴보하고 있었다. 대부분의 자료와 문헌이 소실되고 버려졌다. 유기생물학은 단 하나의 목적을 향해서만 존재하고 있었고 그 목적에 필요하지 않은 모든 것이 잊혀지고 버려졌다. 오직 여기 있는 이들을 만들고 살게 하고 그들의 편의를 돌보기 위한 것들만 남게 되었고 다른 모든 것이 의미를 잃은 것이다. 귀중한 문헌, 유기생물학의 역사, 위대한 로봇의 문명, 그런 것은 이 생물 한 명을 지키고 돌보는 것에 비하면 먼지만큼의 가치도 없는 일이다. 케이는 이 말을 붙잡았다. 차라리 감각기관이 모두 사라져 버렸으면 좋겠다는 생각이 들었다. 환각 프로그램을 몇 기가바이트쯤 두뇌에 들이붓는 기분이었다. 대체 뭐죠? 이것들은? 왜 그런 질문을 하는지 모르겠군. 카스트롭은 긴 팔을 펼쳤다. 표정이 없는 그의 몸짓에서 무한한 감사와 경애의 감정이 묻어났다. 자네가 우리에게 주고 가지 않았나, 위대한 영도자 케이 히스티온. 그제야 생각이 났다. 로봇을 닮은 유기생물. 그건 케이가 마지막에 하던 연구였다. 연구소에서 나오기 몇 년 전부터 그는 2000 모델을 기반으로 로봇을 닮은 유기생물을 창조하는 것에 전념하고 있었다. 세실이 그들을 인간이라고 이름 붙였다. 케이가 이론 단계까지 완성해 놓고 떠난 것이었다. 실험은 성공했다. 단백질들이 로봇의 모양을 흉내내어 자라났다. 꾸준히 느릿느릿 공기를 마시고 다른 유기생물을 뜯어먹으며 주위로부터 흡수한 분자와 원자를 자신의 몸을 구성하는 화학식으로 변화시키며 내가 그것을 만들었다. 신을 조롱하고 위대한 로봇의 가능성을 점치기 위해서 우리의 교활한 지성을 증명하기 위해 로봇이 생명과 영혼까지도 지배할 수 있다는 사실을 증명하기 위해서 케이는 이제 이곳에 온 로봇들에게 일어난 일을 그리고 이 연구소의 모든 직원들에게 일어난 일을 알 수 있었다. 그들은 사랑에 빠져버린 것이다.
So I'll start by just saying why I chose this particular excerpt for the reading. I chose it not only because it's one of the title stories, so it seemed like a good way to represent the collection, but it also jumped out at me. And this one in particular, the English title is On the Origin of Species and What Might Have Happened Thereafter. If you've read the book, you know that the first part of the story is pretty straightforward sci-fi, but with the second, it becomes like sci-fi horror. Which is probably my favorite genre mashup. So it stuck out to me for that reason. If I were to compare it to other works, I would say that it's sort of like Asimov's I, Robot meets Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The other reason that I chose it is because when we were working on this story on the collection, I had actually, well, I don't know if I want to spoil too much of the story. I had just had a child. And so if you've read the story and you know the content, you can imagine that it would have been a bit challenging to work on this particular story in having gone through that experience. So the concept of the story was fascinating to me, but there was also like a kind of revulsion that I had to deal with while working through some of the scenes, which is exactly what you want from horror. You want to be challenged as a reader when you're dealing with that genre. Anyway, to get to the excerpt, for my sake and yours, I'm not going to read one of the more disturbing scenes. I'm going to read the scene that she read was one of my favorite moments in the whole collection. So if you have the copy of the English book, it starts on page 272, and I'll go ahead and jump right in. Okay. The room was full of small white bundles of protein. Tiny robot-shaped proteins lying in little vessels arranged in neat rows. Each bundle was about the size of Kay's forearm, and each bundle was alive. Kay stood there, rapt, gazing at the creatures. They were appallingly beautiful. Their tiny, developing fingers and toes wiggled, and their fledgling bodies squirmed for balance as if still unaccustomed to gravity. And yet they were perfect, as if made by the gods themselves. He didn't have to ask why Professor Strout wanted to show off this place. Clearly, the assumption was that the one specimen Cecil had showed Kay hadn't been sufficient. Kay's brain continued to buzz with hundreds of demons shouting in chorus, "Run, run, run, run." It was all Kay could do to stay upright. It was important to run away before losing control entirely. If not, there's so many, Kay said, though dizziness made talking almost impossible. Why did you make so many? Moving matter devours so many other organisms. How will you ever feed them all? What kind of research are you conducting? Research? What research? It didn't sound as if Professor Strout was being ironic. We just want to grow as many as possible, Professor Strout said. You do have a point, though. We should be aware of our limits. Then again, we can always hire more staff and expand the facility. But why? What do you mean, why? Professor Strout stared at Kay blankly. Everyone else in the room was eyeing Kay suspiciously as well. Just then, Kay flashed on the image of the abandoned library. Organic biology was moving backwards. Most of the literature and data had disappeared or been thrown out. The field existed now for one purpose and one purpose only. Everything that did not serve that purpose had been forgotten or disposed of. What remained was whatever was needed for their creation, their survival, their convenience. Everything else had lost all meaning. Precious records, the history of organic biology, the great robot race, they were worth less than a speck of dust compared to the importance of protecting and caring for these creatures. Kay's hand rose to their forehead. If only all sensory function would just quit right then and there. Kay's brain felt utterly overwhelmed, as if trying to cram in several gigabytes worth of hallucinations all at once. What on earth are they? Kay asked. I don't know why you have to ask. Professor Strout spread out several long arms in a gesture meant to convey boundless esteem and gratitude. You, our great leader, Kay Huston, gifted them to us before you left. At last, Kay remembered, an organism in the image of a robot. That had been Kay's final research project. For years, Kay had poured every ounce of energy into creating a living organism modeled after a 2000 series robot. When Kay left the lab, the project had still only been in the theoretical stages, but clearly it had succeeded since then. Drawing slow and steady breaths, feeding on other organisms, and chemically transforming the molecules and atoms around them to form their bodies, the proteins had indeed grown in the shape of a robot. I made them to mock the gods and manifest our highest potential, to demonstrate our cunning intellect, to prove that robots can rule over life and the soul itself. Kay understood at last what had happened to all the robots who worked at the lab. They'd fallen in love.
기록에 의하면 이 게임은 VIP 유저에게 NPC를 만들 수 있는 툴을 제공했더군요. 간단한 자연어 처리 능력과 음성인식 기능이 있고 누군가가 말을 붙이면 그 말에 어떤 말과 행동으로 대응할지 입력할 수 있어요. 툴 자체는 보잘것없지만 용량의 한계는 없었어요. 초기 단계의 인공지능이라고 볼 수도 있겠지만 지능이라고 말하기는 어렵죠. 입력된 조건에서 입력된 문장밖에 말할 수 없으니까요. 지정된 상황이 아니면 침묵하거나 못 알아들은 척 할 수밖에 없죠. 못 알아듣겠는데? 여행자는 한숨을 쉬었다. 좋아요. 선생님 방식으로 대화해보죠. 그건 호문클루스예요. 아마 선생님이 만드셨겠죠. 연금술사였던 적도 있었죠? 그런 놈들은 잠깐만 이야기해보면 알아. 처음에 사람이라고 생각해서 헷갈렸던 거예요. 또 헷갈릴 만한 말을 했죠. 보통 NPC, 호문클루스는 사람들에게 네가 사람이냐고 묻지 않으니까요. 그 애는 너와 대화했어. 대화하지 않았어요. 그건 혼자 떠들었고 나도 그랬죠. 제가 바깥 세상 용어를 쓰니까 무슨 말인지 못 알아듣는 것처럼 행동했고요. 처음에는 롤플레이어의 고집이라고 생각했는데 지금 생각해보니 질문에 대한 답이 입력되어 있지 않았던 거예요. 게다가 답변도 비상식적이었죠. 선생님이 몇 가지 대화 패턴을 입력한 뒤 내 앞에 들이민 거예요. 사람이 한 명 더 등장하면 제가 할 만한 행동이야 뻔하니까요. 다시 만나도 아마 토시 하나 빠뜨리지 않고 똑같이 말하겠죠. 그래서 묻고 싶은데요. 천사는 공중에 동그라미를 그렸고 허공에 생겨난 구멍 속으로 종이를 집어넣었다. 구멍은 종이를 삼키고 회전하며 사라졌다. 그건 무슨 의미였죠? 나랑 같이 놀아보자는 건가요? 혼자 노는 게 새삼 심심해졌어요. 난 규칙도 모른 채 뭔가 다른 게임 속으로 들어와 버린 것 같은데 대체 무슨 놀이를 하는 거죠? 사내는 몸을 일으켰다. 지저귀던 새들이 노래를 멈췄고 바람이 다시 불어와 5종류의 꽃과 이파리를 사내의 어깨 위로 떨어뜨렸다. 그는 미소를 짓더니 허리에서 칼을 뽑아들었다. 태양빛이 칼에 부딪혀 뿌려지는 동안에도 천사는 눈만 깜빡였다. 사내가 칼을 들었다. 그제야 천사는 그가 하려는 일을 깨닫고 비명을 지르며 굴렀다. 도망치려다가 무거운 날개 때문에 넘어졌고 자신이 육상 생물이 아니라는 것을 깨닫고 날개를 폈다. 사내는 무시무시한 속도로 달려들어 날개에 깊이 칼을 박았다. 칼은 그의 날개를 뚫고 들어가 땅에 손잡이까지 박혔다. 천사는 공중에서 잡아채이듯이 바닥에 부딪혔다. 그가 간신히 몸을 일으키고 바닥에 박힌 날개를 뽑아내려고 애쓰는 사이에 사내는 어깨에서 활을 뽑아들고 화살을 먹인 뒤 한 바퀴 돌아 앞에 섰다. 이러지 말아요. 천사가 헐떡이며 말했다. 어차피 죽지 않는다는 걸 알아요. 망자의 늪에서 다시 살아나죠. 그러면 두렵지 않겠군. 사내는 시위를 당겼고 천사는 비명을 지르며 얼굴을 감쌌다. 화살은 날개를 아슬아슬하게 스쳐 땅에 박혔고 그는 꺾인 날개를 푸드덕거리며 발버둥 쳤다. 사내는 그의 목에 칼을 들이대었다. 나는 내 놈과 놀 생각이 없어. 더 이상 내 놈의 잣대로 나와 내 주변의 것들을 재고 진단하지 마라. 내가 온 세상의 용어로 이곳을 더럽히지도 마라. 지금까지는 참아주었지만 더 이상은 참지 않겠다. 계속 멋대로 입을 놀리면 그만둬요. 스산하게 몰아치던 바람이 잠잠해졌다. 물결 같은 머리카락을 휘날리는 여인이 이마에 뿔을 박은 점박이 말을 타고 다가왔다. 사내는 화를 내리며 말했다. 이자가 널 모욕했어. 그 사람을 그리 대하면 이 세계 전체에 좋지 않아요. 내가 이자를 어찌 대하든 달라지는 것은 없어. 그렇지 않아요. 난 아직 기회가 있다고 믿어요. 천사는 뭔가 항의하고 싶은 표정으로 두 사람의 대화를 눈으로 따라갔다. 여자는 말에서 뛰어내려 다가왔다. 그녀는 날개에 꽂힌 검을 향해 주문을 외웠고 가는 말을 알아들은 것처럼 날아올라 사내의 검집으로 돌아갔다. 그녀의 입에서 나온 말들이 빛으로 변하여 상처로 스며들었다. 벌어진 상처가 아물었다. 천사는 입을 삐죽 내밀고 상대를 노려보았다. 어떻게 하는 거죠? 상처를 치료했어요. 어떻게 대화를 하는 거죠? 이중인격인가요? 1인 2역인가요? 혼자 캐릭터 2개를 쓰는 건가요? 네? 넌 누구야? 무슨 의미로 묻는 거죠?
Thank you, Boyan. That was great. So the excerpt is from a story called Scripter, and I'll start with a quick outline of the story. So Scripter takes place entirely inside a simulation game that is so outmoded that it's about to be discontinued by the company that maintains its server. But there is one player still logging into it daily, and this is a problem for the company as they are contractually obligated to keep the game alive as long as there's an active account. So the company hopes to buy out this player, but this player's real life ID is untraceable. So an agent representing the company is deployed into the game in the form of an angel character to contact and persuade the player to close their account. But as the angel makes his entrance into the game and makes his speech to the player, the hunter character, the hunter so consistently refuses to comprehend the angel's proposal while maintaining his in-game persona. And to add to the angel's difficulty is this beautiful female character he encounters, previously unknown to the company. And while he initially believes that she is a character controlled by a freeloading hacker, he soon begins to suspect that she might be an NPC, a non-player character coded by the player himself in order to keep his lonely character company. But other things happen, and it becomes increasingly unclear if our assumptions, if the agent's assumptions about the hunter character aren't completely off base. So the story continues to spin forward as the agent, the angel character, struggles to unveil the identities of these in-game characters, as the characters cycle back and forth between humans pretending to be AIs and AIs pretending to be humans or believing themselves to be humans. So here's the excerpt, and it begins where the angel character accuses the player, the hunter character, of denying that he had created an NPC and that the character is just nothing more than a chatbot. According to our records, the angel began. The game's VIP users were provided with an NPC spawning tool capable of natural language processing and voice recognition. Using this tool, players were able to code NPCs capable of interacting with other entities based on real-time input data. It was a deceptively modest tool with endless capacity. Some consider these NPCs to be primitive AI, but I think it's a stretch to compare what they do to intelligence. All they do is spout pre-programmed responses based on pre-programmed conditions. For anything off script, they can only climb up or pretend you've lost them. You've lost me, the hunter said. The angel gave him a quick eye roll. Fine, allow me to flesh it out in your terms then. She is a homunculus. You've been an alchemist in the past, correct? My guess is that she's your creation. A moment's conversation should be enough for you to tell if that's the case or not, the hunter replied. Well, it confused me at first because I assumed she was a human player. And she threw me that trick question. NPCs, I mean, homunculi, don't usually ask people if they're people. You had a conversation with a girl, the hunter insisted. That wasn't a conversation, the angel scoffed. We both might as well have been talking to ourselves. She didn't understand me when I confronted her with real-world speech. I'd have chalked it up to role-player stubbornness, but it's obvious to me now that she wasn't programmed to answer my questions. And none of her responses made any real sense anyway. In the background, an NPC was stuck in a glitch loop. His mouth kept opening and closing as he kept stepping forward, only to be jerked back to the ground again. You, sir, obviously coded a few more conversation patterns in her before shoving her in front of me. I bet she'll repeat the same exact lines to me when the next time I see her. Then the angel traced another circle in the air and slid the papers into the hole that appeared once again. After swallowing the papers, the hole spiraled shut and vanished. So why'd you do it? Were you trying to get me to play with you? Have you finally grown bored of playing by yourself after all these years? I feel like I've blundered into a strange game where the rules keep shifting. Just what kind of game are you playing? The hunter stood wordlessly. Birds stopped chirping and the wind returned, depositing 5 different kinds of petals and leaves on the hunter's shoulders. He smiled and drew a sword from his waist. Yet, even as the blade caught the sun, sending a shower of rays in all directions, the angel just stood there, blinking passively. The hunter raised his sword overhead. Only then did the angel realize what the hunter was aiming for. He screamed and turned to run, but his heavy wings threw him off balance and knocked him off his feet. Rudely reminded that he was no longer land-bound, the angel spread his wings and started to take off, but the hunter charged towards him at a terrible speed and plunged his sword into one of his wings, snatching him out of the air and slamming him against the ground. The sword buried itself in the earth all the way to the hilt. As the angel struggled to sit up and free himself, the hunter selected an arrow from his quiver, drew his bow, and walked around to face the angel. Please don't, the angel whimpered. You know it won't actually kill me. I'll just respawn at the swamp of the undead. Then you've got nothing to fear, the hunter told him and released the arrow. It grazed the edge of one wing and plunged into the ground. The angel shrieked and flapped his broken wings in panic. Drawing another sword out of its scabbard with a metallic swoosh, the hunter brought its gleaming tip down to the angel's throat. I have no desire to play with the likes of you. Stop judging me and my world by your standards, and quit corrupting this place with your language. I've tried to play along, but I won't stand for it anymore. You start running your mouth again? Stop. The eerie wind that had been whipping past suddenly calmed. The woman, her hair rippling behind her, rode towards them on a horned Appaloosa. The hunter lowered his weapon and turned to the woman. But he insulted you, he protested. Treating him like this doesn't bode well for this world, she replied. No matter how I treat him, the fate of this world isn't going to change. You're wrong. I still believe there's hope. The angel watched their exchange intently. The woman jumped off the horse and walked towards the angel, uttering a series of incantations at the sword buried in his wing. Obeying her command, the sword flew into the air and back into the scabbard at the hunter's side. Her words transformed into a beam of light and filled the angel's wound. In a blink, the gaping hole closed without a trace. The angel shot her a withering look. How'd you do that? He hissed. I healed it, she told him. Huh, how are you even talking to me? Are you playing a double role? Yes, you're controlling two characters simultaneously, aren't you? Pardon me, she said, uncomprehending. Who the hell are you? What do you mean by that?
Thank you, Jungmin, for the wonderful reading. I would say that these two stories of post-human genesis and the virtual reality apocalypse that spills over into material reality showcase the diversity and poignancy of Bo Young's works. Now I'll introduce Bora Chung. Bora is a scholar of Russian literature. She received an MA from Yale University and PhD from Indiana University. She currently teaches Russian literature and science fiction at Yonsei University in Seoul and has translated a number of Russian and Polish writers into Korean, such as Bruno Schulz, Mikhail Bulgakov, and Milos Urban. K-media products are known, as you know, for its radical, in-your-face genre of hybridization. And Bora writes freely across the boundaries: SF, fantasy, romance, mystery, horror, martial fiction, wuxia, you name it. We could not invite her excellent translator, Anton Her, today, and Bora has kindly agreed to read her work in English for us. I'm glad to present to you Bora Chung.
Hi, I'm Bora, and I'm going to read. I'm not sure if I'm a science fiction writer, so I'm not really sure why Professor Park decided to invite me here. But thank you so much for having me. And I'm supposed to read the one and only science fiction story from Chris Bunny. It's entitled Goodbye, My Love, and it's about so it's about a woman who develops spousal or companion robots. So she's the test pilot for prototype companion robots, and so she always has several companion robots around the house, but she's really emotionally attached to her very first model, and that's Model 1. And Model 1 has been outdated and it's been non-functional for a long time. And she couldn't dispose of it, so she kept the model in her closet. But she realizes that she could transfer all the memory from Model 1 to a new model, updating the software, but updating the hardware and keeping the software and all the memory. So she decides to finally get rid of the old Model 1 after syncing the memory with the new one. And this is actually a spoiler. This is the end of the story, so you get to know how it ends. But anyways, here it goes. Unlike with the bodies of humans, we cannot formalize our farewell with artificial beings, nor can we bury or cremate them. All we can do is call the manufacturer and pass them on for disposal. The thought of Model 1's body being picked up and processed in the recycling plant of the manufacturer makes my flesh crawl. But in comparison to the image of Model 1 forever gathering dust in my closet, I start thinking that the official option would be better for her in the end. After a long time thinking about this, I finally get out of bed. I turn on my computer and bring up the website of Model 1's manufacturer, my first employer. The thought that it was this company that had created my first love, as well as being my first job, and she being therefore my first masterpiece, makes me feel slightly sentimental and gives me pause. But in the midst of my hesitation, I wander into the catalog page and find an artificial companion with brown hair and green eyes, almost identical to Model 1, which is enough to make me decide then and there. The company has expedited delivery. If I put in my order now, a new Model 1 will arrive before Seth leaves. Then I just need to initialize the new companion and synchronize her. An indirect way of doing it, but all of Model 1's memories will then be stored in the new Model 1. Instead of a pile of heartbreaking junk sitting in the closet that gives me pangs of anxiety whenever I have to boot it up, I'll be able to begin again with a new Model 1 that remembers all the times I've had with the previous Model 1. I open the online form for disposal requests and begin filling it in. Someone enters the room. Lights. I shout as a shadow swiftly traverses the dark room towards me. The moment the lights come on, a knife stabs my heart. I see Seth and Derek. These two are the new model companions. I see Seth and Derek supporting Model 1 between them. As I stare immobile, Seth wrests the computer from my hands and erases the contents of the disposal form. He closes the browser window and shuts down the computer. Seth places the computer on the bed, and Derek also puts the knife smeared with my blood on the bed covers. But why, I want to ask. How could you? But I can't find my voice. I had a lot of time to think while I was in the closet. It is Seth who is talking to me. The human body begins to decline dramatically at the age of 60, but they live on for 10, 20, even 30 more years. We were developed to aid such humans and enhance their quality of life. Derek takes over. An artificial companion is disposed of after 2 or 3 years, 4 years at most, even when we function normally. Just a few replacement parts or a software upgrade could help us serve you for a decade longer, but we're treated like trash as soon as there is a new model, when even that new model will become trash in 2 or 3 years. Seth speaks again. Ever since I was born, I existed only for you. I wanted to be irreplaceable to you, the only one in the world to somebody. In perfect unison, the three take one step closer. I see Seth's hand on the nape of Model 1's neck and Derek holding her waist. Apparently, the three of them have connected their power sources and central processing units. That explains how Model 1, whose power supply had been completely frazzled, could stand there with her eyes open. I had no idea such a thing was possible. Or actually, I knew it was possible, but I'd never imagined it happening outside of a laboratory experiment conducted by an engineer, that the companions could actually hook each other up like that on their own. But in terms of what was possible or impossible, the current situation had fallen into the latter category. A robot stabbing a human with a knife for trying to dispose of them. Which had been the one to stab me? Derek had been the one holding the knife, but Model 1 was the one angry at me for being disposed. And as for the one who had received all of Model 1's memories and passed them on to Derek, that was Seth. But distinguishing between the three is now meaningless. Seth, Derek, and Model 1 are now synchronized. Their memories and thoughts are completely congruent, and they're even physically connected to each other. None of the three are going to call an ambulance for me. Can synchronization override the fundamental protocol of human protection just because one of them happens to be malfunctioning? Ambulance. I'm mouthing the words now. Save me. Instead of words, I only cough. What spurts up out of my mouth is blood. The three start approaching me again. Model 1, still supported by the two of them, awkwardly lowers her head to make eye contact with me. Goodbye, my love. Her farewell is whispered. On my forehead, a light kiss. An inexplicable mix of pity and sadness on her face. The same pity and sadness are reflected in all three of their faces. That's when it hits me. The moment I was stabbed, the moment I coughed blood, neither moment had frightened me more than this one. The beings I see before me are not the machines I had known. No, the machines I had thought I'd known. Whatever I believed before, these are not machines that resemble humans at all. They are something completely alien from us, something I could never comprehend. Model 1 whispers again. Goodbye, my love. Yep, that's it.
Thank you, Bora Chung, for reading your work. I'm Seoyeon Lee. I'm a second year PhD student at USC. And my research centers on the intersection of contemporary Korean and Chinese science fiction and the works of women writers. As a discussion, I'm very happy to be here today. And thanks Kaya Press for allowing me to share my reflection on the two writers' works and ask them questions. The English translation of On the Origin of Species and Other Stories includes Boyoung Kim's short stories that challenge the concept of normalcy and suggest the possibilities of coexistence with diverse beings from animals and plants to alien beings and robots based on her scientific imagination. So through the use of science fiction themes such as robot and human, cyberspace and reality, time travel, and so on, Kim's stories dispute the canon that we used to or still believe as truth. Her science fiction imagination dismantles the anthropocentric and male-centric thinking, which originated from the modern concept of science, history, and religion to defamiliarize reality. At the same time, this effect of cognitive estrangement encourages readers to understand various others, non-human beings, and the universe beyond the Earth. In her anthology, for example, the social structure of family and marriage is considered a peculiar custom in the eyes of robots. And the alien suffering from occasional loss of consciousness is labeled a minority and is considered disabled on her planet, whereas her sleeping pattern is normal on Earth. Given that we can embrace differences to envision a better future by just slightly changing our thoughts, SF is a literary genre that pays attention to human beings' past and present and also the future. So Kim's SF short stories also questions what it means to be human as they expand and revise the definition of humanity. In scripture, when the Andrew character asks the Hunter character why he wanted to live in cyberspace, he responds by saying that he just wanted to know whether someone who couldn't prove they were human could still be accepted as one. This anthology, Cursed Bunny, also touches on the issue of humanity and human alienation. Jung's unique literary style and narrative technique invite readers to the somewhat creepy and suspenseful wonderland. By deploying the aesthetic of fantasy, her fictional reality presents a life that is often very close to death and full of small and large threats of violence with dangerous curses and revenge. For instance, in Goodbye, My Love, 3 artificial companions kill their human owner after realizing that the oldest model will be thrown out. While in Cursed Bunny, Home Sweet Home, and Reunion, the familiar people such as the narrator's grandfather or a son or a lover, they suddenly turn out to be ghosts at the end of the stories. Also, the head made of woman's fallen out hair and feces comes out of the toilet and calls her mother, and it finally takes up her position and acts as host. So this ridiculous and nonsensical reality, however, looks very similar to the present we are living in. If we twist our perception a bit, Chung's description of absurdity is in fact a humorous insight and sincere advice on life. Considering that human isolation and dignity are one of the biggest challenges that we encounter in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, Jung's focus on the entanglements between humans and other beings, whether we believe they are dead or alive, blurs the boundary of center and periphery. From her ironic storytelling, audiences will find Chung's thoughtful consideration of marginality attractive enough to reimagine the word beyond the human-centric viewpoint. So I have two questions for both authors. My first question is about Korean SF in relation to gender. So imagination, especially the realm of scientific imagination, is often considered to belong to the West male-dominated culture. Recently, Asian women writers, SF, and fantasy literature has received increasing attention, and this noteworthy phenomenon inspires many scholars in SF culture studies and gender studies. The other Kim participated at the Asia Pacific Science Fiction Convention 2018 in Beijing and met prestigious Chinese SF writers such as Liu Cixin, Han Song, and the woman writer Tang Fei. You've also referred it to the feminist movement as a key factor in developing Korean SF culture while attending the forum entitled Female Power in SF. Since the Gangnam Station femicide occurred in 2016, 5 years have passed, and yet misogyny and gender inequality are the key words reflecting in Korean society. Recently, the Real Doll Industries and SM Entertainment's new group, aespa, which has the avatar members of the virtual world, have caused controversy. In this regard, given that women's rights and technological developments are closely intertwined, I want to ask both writers how Korean women writers' SF imaginations reflect on and criticize the present, and how they eventually challenge the existing paradigms of thought which are embedded in Korean society. And my next question for both of you centers on Korean science fiction in the global context. I realized that Kim's SF short story on evolutionary myths was translated into Chinese 神之进化 and introduced it to Chinese SF fandoms through Korea-China SF Culture Exchange Project, projected by fantasy literature webzine Mirror. Since this work received a huge response from Chinese-speaking countries, so could you tell us more about why it appealed to the Chinese audiences and what the most impressive experience was while communicating and cooperating with the SF writers from China, Japan, India, and so forth? The author Chung has expertise not only in Korean literature, but also in Russian literatures and cultures. So could you share your experience if you've been influenced by Russian speculative literature while writing your work in Korean, or if you've found a new approach to analyze Korean SF literature while reading Russian SF works? So these are all my questions, and thanks for listening. And author Kim, would you like to go first? 김보영 작가님, 네, 답변 부탁드립니다.
저 사라졌어요. 비디오를 시작할 수 없대요. 예, 이렇게.
Yeah, we live with these technical issues.
Okay. Maybe Chung first. 예, 비디오가 시작할 수 없다네요.
Then shall we start from Bora Chung first?
Yeah, let's do that.
My major is 20th century utopian literature, and utopia dystopia eventually overlap with science fiction. And it seems like Russian and East European tradition has a wider definition of science fiction. Anything that has a system, whether it's social scientific system or natural scientific system, anything that presents a world with a different kind of system is considered science fiction. And they actually call it scientific fantasy, which I like more. And I believe the term scientific fantasy has affected or influenced the terminology in other communist countries such as China and North Korea. So in North Korea, they call it scientific fantasy as well. So that kind of wider berth to the definition of science fiction makes me feel freer when I talk about things. And also writers in general, not only science fiction writers, but Russian writers in general who lived during the communist revolution and the 1920s, saw the revolution, had high expectations for a new world, and then saw what kind of bloodbath the revolution brought in. And then they also witnessed the Stalinist oppression at the end of the 20s and throughout the 30s. So they saw their worlds crumble. And this immense sense of loss and despair is apparent in most of their works. And it's kind of really poignant. It's really heartbreaking. And the way they see the world and the way they communicate that kind of despair and the slow loss and the crumbling of everything they believed in. It's just it really had an impact on me. So I try to learn their style, learn their point of view and the way they communicate, the way they convey their message. And I try to do that with my own work, maybe more unconsciously than consciously. And as for feminism and science fiction, well, my opinion probably differs from Boyoung's because I believe science fiction writing can't really do anything. So I go to protests and I march and I scream, and you have to like you have to throw a fit like in front of the city hall or somewhere visible. You have to throw a fit and throw a tantrum and like make all this noise. And COVID made it really difficult. So it's kind of really frustrating. It's been very frustrating, but that's what I think. And I learn a lot, and women's rights, and especially reproductive rights are as Seoyeon Lee said, very closely, very tightly related to the development of technology and science. And it doesn't always go with respecting women or respecting whoever has the reproductive organs as thinking sentient subjects. So that I learn these things every time I go to a protest. I learn new things, and I learn, I'm sorry to say, horrible new things. And I guess I get pissed off and I write stories and I go to more protests.
Thank you, Bora. I think we can move on to Boyoung, letting her speak from her virtual reality. Now, since Bora mentioned she loudly wondered why she's invited to this event, she also has other science fiction stories like The Seed, which is one of the early environmental science fiction. And she came to SF WorldCon and showed how articulate she is in presenting the science fiction world in South Korea, including Kim Boyoung's works. Now, I wonder, Boyoung, are you able to speak from virtual space?
소리는 나오는데 지금 여전히 비디오가 안 됩니다. 죄송합니다. 예, 저는 오디오로 참여하겠습니다.
Yeah, it's okay.
예.
She's going to participate in audio. Yeah, please go ahead.
예, 사실 정보라 작가님께서는 실제로 현실에서 활동을 하고 계시고 투쟁을 하시고 시위를 적극적으로 하시는 분이라 제가 이론적인 이야기만 하는 게 좀 부끄럽는데요. 예, 한국 SF가 말씀하셨다시피 지난 5년 사이에 눈부시게 성장을 했는데 많은 요인이 있었지만 페미니즘 운동이 분명히 그 한 축이었다고 생각을 하고요. 2016년 무렵에 여러 가지 사건이 있으면서 사회 전반에 여성운동이 일어났고 문학계에서도 여성문학이 주목받기 시작을 했어요. 그래서 문학계에서 여성주의 고전 문학을 소개를 하는데 그들 대부분이 SF였던 거죠. 여기서 잠깐 통역하고 그 다음에 다시 진행할게요. 예.
네. Okay, so I'm doing the interpretation here. So she wants to, she mentions how Bora is actively participating in this feminist protest. And she wanted to discuss the issue from another perspective, how historically, about the last 5 years, from with the perspective within the SF world, SF has had a remarkable growth, and one of the momentum came from clearly feminist movement. And around 2016, there have been, I don't know, maybe some of you have been following, including me too, in the Korean version too, there have been waves of activism, and that gave spotlight on women's literature in general. And as women feminist critics and writers began to search for these classics of feminist literature, they were discovered, surprisingly, that many of them are SF, right? Because, yeah.
예, 계속 할게요. For example, Gerrit Brandenberg's Eagle's Daughter, and Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and James Tiptree Jr.'s The Screwfly Solution, and also Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now speaking Korean. 바로 이 무렵에 딱 그 무렵이 프랑켄슈타인 200주년이어서 전 세계적으로도 프랑켄슈타인을 재조명하는 이벤트가 있었고 한국에서도 있었는데, 그러면서 이 작품이 SF의 기원으로 소개가 되고 SF와 여성 작가 SF 소설이 주목받는 그런 계기가 되었다고 봅니다. 그리고 소설을 읽는 사람은 한국에서 여성이 훨씬 더 많기 때문에 이들이 SF에 주목하면서 SF장이 크게 넓어지게 되었다고 생각을 해요.
So,
말씀하세요. 예.
So here, I see that Boyoung is giving us, right, the question that Seoyeon asked about the feminism and SF relationship. She's giving us how feminism and SF development have been entwined with each other. And here I'm going to just read, tell you the titles of the works she mentioned: Igalia's Daughters, The Left Hand of Darkness, The Handmaid's Tale, The Screwfly Solution, and Frankenstein. These are all classics of feminist SF in the West. And this was is also, I don't remember exact time, the Frankenstein, the second centennial was there. And so around the world, there were big events. And South Koreans also held events that they celebrated the birth of Frankenstein. So this kind of, because SF world doesn't have much criticism so far in South Korea, the Frankenstein centennial basically called attention to the fact that SF was born by a woman writer, and that's acknowledged as such in the West. And then another reason is that within South Korea, the fiction readership, it's believed that women account for the majority of them. And as they began to attend SF, the field of SF began to expand much more rapidly.
그리고 마지막으로 제가 한국 SF사에서 좀 특이한 점을 하나 소개를 하고 싶은데요. 저는 아무래도 2000년대 한국 SF 창작 단편의 큰 기준을 마련한 사람은 아무래도 듀나라고 생각을 해요. 그런데 듀나는 특이하게도 그 성별이나 개인정보를 드러내지 않고 25년째 온라인에서만 활동을 하고 있어요. 그래서 지금 가장 활발하게 활동하고 있는 작가 중에 선배라고 할 수 있는 분이 성별을 드러내지 않는다는 점이 분명히 한국 SF에 끼친 영향이 있다고 생각을 해요. 그래서 그 퀴어적이고 페미니즘적인 시각이 비주류가 되지 않게 하는 면이 있다고 생각을 합니다.
Yeah. Okay, so she's referring to another writer. Now I introduced to you that Boyoung Kim is the most established woman SF writer in South Korea. There's a writer whose gender identity remains unknown, Duna. This is nickname, and that's all we know. So Boyoung Kim is saying that for 25 years, Duna has not revealed which is preferred the pronoun of the writer, gender identity or anything further, private information. And Duna has played a major role in laying the foundation for the development of South Korean SF. For that reason, the queerness, so within SF world, queer or feminist perspectives have never been, at least circa 1990s when Duna began to be active, considered as non-mainstream. Yeah. And among the new generation writers too, there are some who would not reveal their identity and use a pseudonym and nor gender identity and publish their works on and offline. Yeah. Thank you, Boyo.
Thank you.
Would you like to reply to the question about your relationship with the Chinese SF fandom writers?
예.
Yeah.
예, 그것도 2017년인데, 그러니까 2016년 정도가 한국 SF 분기라고 했는데 역시 맞물려 있죠. 예, 그때 한국 환상문화계층 거울하고 중국의 Future Affairs Administration, 미래 사무관리국과 각국의 SF를 교환하는 이벤트를 했는데요. 예, 저도 그때 삼체 이후로 처음 중국 SF를 읽게 되었어요. 그때 예, 제 진화하시다가 거기 소개되면서 이틀간 77,000 조회수가 나왔다면서 운영진들이 많이 축하를 해줬는데 그때 많이 들은 이야기가 이 이야기가 제가 그 이야기에 한국의 역사와 전설을 많이 넣었는데 마치 중국과 같다. 예, 중국과 너무 닮았다. 그러면서 어째서 우리가 바로 옆에 있는 같은 문화권의 SF를 보지 않고 완전히 문화가 다른 서양의 SF를만 보고 있었을까 하는 감상을 들었고 저도 중국의 SF를 보면서 마찬가지 느낌을 받았어요. 예, 예.
Okay, thank you. So in Boyoung's recent memory, the SF began to have another spurt of momentum that is making it quite mainstream now from 2016 on. And in 2017, China, as far as I know, has like 3 big fandom organizations, and one of them, Future Affairs Administration, have approached Mirror, which is the best-known Korean fantasy literature webzine, which has been publishing SF as well, and suggested an event in which the Chinese and Korean SF writers' works are exchanged and translated. So for the first time since the Rebody Problem, it provided opportunity for Boyoung to read the Chinese SF. And she was told by the Chinese organizers that her short story, Evolution Myth, had 77,000 readings record in 2 days. Yeah. So, and many Chinese readers commented how she includes her reference to this, the Korean history, ancient Korean history, the myth, the legend, the dragon, gave them like a familiar feel to the story. And that made her wonder, why is it that Boyoung has not been able to read these SF stories from neighboring cultures rather than the West? And so she would, when she read the Chinese SF, she also felt, because she does use a lot of ancient Korean myths and legends in her story, that certain familiarity, cultural familiarity to them. Okay, so here we have the writers' responses ended, and we are going to have audience Q&A sessions.
보라정님 러시아 문학 말씀하셨었나요?
Yes, she has covered it in the beginning. Okay, Mehdi, could you send me the questions? While we are waiting for it, I have questions actually for translators. So Samuel Delaney has famously said the difference between SF and the realist fiction is when you say like there are 2 suns in the sky, it's a metaphorical expression in the realist fiction, but in science fiction, it's actually literally true, right? And I wonder, Sora, let's say, that you have translated other works, I mean, Chongmin, you too, and what was your experience in translating science fiction? Was there any particular like study you had to do, read up to translate these?
I mean, do you want to start?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So it was my first time translating anything literary, in fact. And so it was, of course, my first time translating sci-fi. And I quickly learned that you almost have to acquire a third language of science and to speak this very specific lingo with some fluency and conviction. I mean, for me, I had to do a lot of research because I'm not a working scientist, and and I didn't have much background knowledge. Although I was familiar with some of the concepts, so I had to really dig in to the concepts that the stories contained, and yeah. So, but that in itself was not such a huge switch in gears for me, because I do academic and business or technical translation on the side. Actually, not on the side, that's the main thing. But so that itself was not such a huge deal. But I also realized that with literary translation, a deeper commitment to the content of sci-fi was required of the translator, because to really fully flesh out the story's universe and convey the concepts and the possibilities, you not only have to have a really good grasp of the scientific ideas, but you also have to grapple with the philosophical and symbolic issues that the story raises. And just doing a line by line translation would be really mechanical, and you would risk some serious inconsistency and even incoherence. So yeah, that's what I experienced.
Okay, Sora, I'm going to expand the question a bit. When I launched the Megapie series in global Korean literature with Gaia Press, Sora was one of the inspirations, and there were people around me, younger scholars, who wanted Korean literature series that introduce genre fiction, which is largely ignored because they're not gonna win any Nobel Prize for South Korea by the institutional support. And so, but we are seeing like very radical voices as you sampled, as we sampled today. And so there was this kind of emerging voices who wanted to see more genre fiction in translation. And Sora has been doing it for Gaia Press, but also other publishers. And I wonder, and she has been getting actually fabulous responses as far as I know. And I wonder if you can also share your experience with the publication of other genre fiction as well as translation.
Okay. Yeah, I can try. This collection was really my first really in-depth experience with translating science fiction. I'd done a little bit, but not quite as much or as sort of hard sci-fi as this collection is, in the sense that it's world building on another level. Like some of the other things that I had worked on were maybe a little more softer sci-fi, or sort of playing with blending genres, where it was like literary fiction with a sci-fi angle. Whereas with this collection, it really it was a steep learning curve for me. And some of the elements were sort of common to any sort of translation. So like when you're translating literature, you mentioned the idea of like, are the two suns literal or metaphorical? So with any kind of translation, you're having to figure out, okay, what's accidental to the language, like just simply a feature of the language that you're translating, versus what's deliberate on the part of the writer. And what I realized with sci-fi is that it's almost like it's almost twice as hard, because you're having to figure out, like, you know, really what is this world that the author is building. And so really fascinating challenge for both of us, me, Chongmin and I, while working through this book. So even though I had experience translating other works and other genres, including horror, crime fiction, this was like, I felt like I was starting from scratch, honestly, as a translator. So I was very grateful to Chongmin that I was not alone project. We had a
I
lot
was
of.
very grateful to be invited.
And yet,
Oh, you saved me.
despite these difficulties, if you take a look at the book, it's beautifully translated. I'm very grateful for your all the work that you put into this. Okay, now I have questions here. Now I'm going to phrase the questions as simple as possible so that Boyoung Kim wouldn't need my interpretation into Korean for the question. This question is for, I think, the writers. So both Boyoung and Bora, feel free to reply. How would you identify Korean science fiction? What is Korean of Korean science fiction? Yeah. How do you compare it with the science fiction of other countries?
예, 바로 네, 상당히 그 미국인이 미국 SF의 정체성을 말하라고 질문해도 역시 어려울 거고, 예, 저도 어렵습니다. 한국 작가들도 모두 천차만별이기 때문에, 예, 단지 제가 다른 질문에서 서구의 남성주의 SF에서 어떤 이제 변화를 꾀하시느냐 이런 질문이 있다가 이제 이번엔 질문 안 했는데, 제가 그걸 듣고 바로 생각한 게 서구의 남성주의 SF는 한국 문학계에서 단 한 번도 줄이었던 적이 없는데 이런 생각을 했었죠. 그러니까 결국 제가 한국에 살고 있기 때문에 제가 좋아했던 어떤 작품의 역사를 생각해도 남성주의라고 했을 때는 홍콩 느와르 영화를 가장 좋아했었고, 예, SF라고 했을 때는 일본의 애니메이션이나 게임을 많이 보았고, 그리고 근원적으로는 한국의 SF를 보고 자랐죠. 예, 특히 한국의 SF 소설은 최근에 흥행을 했다고 해도 한국의 SF 만화는 계속 있었기 때문에, 예, 그런 면에서 당연히 다른 면이 있겠지요.
Okay, so she says the American SF writers will also find it very difficult to characterize American SF because there's such a variety. Yeah, and in South Korea too, by now there's a very diverse spectrum of writers, and therefore it's difficult to say this is Korean. However, she wants to point out that somebody asked her, so like in the West, male-centered SF, in fact, in the West, like 20 to 30%, I think, are women writers. And how does Korean SF differ from it? Well, she wants to answer that male-centered, the Western hard SF kind of vein of science fiction never became mainstream in South Korea, and therefore, like South Korean writers never were shaped. Didn't have any phase in which they were shaped by that so-called mainstream SF of the West. And she's talking about how also the SF culture for her meant not just the American or Anglo-Saxon ones, but also Hong Kong films, Japanese animation, and also Korean SF animation and the manga. So this kind of cosmopolitan character can be described as distinctive of South Korean SF. Bora, do you want
to? I currently teach, the academic year hasn't ended yet in Korea, so I am still teaching a science fiction class. And this is from my students, not exactly I agree. My students who are well-versed in science fiction are more familiar with English language science fiction or Chinese or Japanese science fiction. And they say, so some of them have read Korean science fiction for the first time in my class. And they say Korean science fiction tends to be more of a social commentary. So like, we do have so-called hard science fiction writers, such as our own Boyoung Kim and other writers. Changyu Kim is an engineer. Hadoyeon has a PhD in astronomy, and he is actually working as a researcher, and so on and so forth. But all my students say, and I feel the same, that because we have never been the center of the universe, I mean, Korean people, we didn't have a national policy of conquesting the space. We were never a part of that space race during the Cold War. America was the United States was a center, one of the two pillars of the space race during the Cold War for 50 years. So that must have influenced the science field in general and the science fiction area. I am kind of extrapolating from the Soviet experience, but when you are in the center of the universe, you kind of feel that way, and then some people question it, but there is that question, but that question never arose in Korea because we were never part of it. So like I think Korean science fiction writers tend to be more introspective, and we think about the Korean society, we think about how and where we are going, we think about how to change our society more than going out there and discovering a new planet. And even when people are writing about going out there and discovering a new planet, they always come back to the Korean society, I think, and what we're facing right now, here and now. So I think that whether it's satire or whether it's serious social commentary, I think that speculation, I mean introspection of our own reality.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
You see now why I have invited Bora, right? And Bora is kind of, she illustrates the cosmopolitan character of exemplify South Korean science fiction world, because she specializes and translates this science fiction and speculative fiction from Russia and Eastern Europe, where the tradition had strengths traditionally. Yeah. Okay, we can have like one or two questions. Oh, okay. So this is a question for Boyoung. Huge fan of your work. Your style, not just the themes, but style, diction, tone, and pace, exquisitely crafted, contemplative, yet crystalline. I was wondering whether you could share some authors who served as your literary inspiration to that end, including writers within and beyond the SF genre. So, 김보영 작가님, 아까 그 서론에서도 말씀드렸지만은 이제 작가님의 그 문체에 대한 코멘트고요. 그래서 어떤 작가들의 만화나 이런 거 말고요, 작가들의 영향을 받았나는 질문입니다. 김보영 작가님.
예, 사실 자기가 마찬가지로 자기가 누구에게 그렇게 영향을 받았는지 다 떠올리기 어렵습니다. 그런데 다른 데서도 얘기했던 것 같은데 제가 가장 영향을 받은 사람은 헤르만 헤세인 것 같고요. 예.
Can I just intervene one second? 김보영 작가님. 전에 박완서 작가님은 어디 딴 데서 얘기하셨던 것 같은데.
저기 박완서 작가님은 제가 한국어를 공부하기 위해서 어떤 SF가 아니라 한국어 문체로서는 그분보다 잘 쓰시는 분이 없는 것 같고요. 예, 그 외에는 사실 여러 정말 만화와 게임이었던 것 같습니다.
Okay, so Boyoung wants to say that for themes and ideas, a lot of animation and manhwa have been inspiration, but for the writing style, and among the writers, Hermann Hesse, who's a philosophical, mythical quality, have inspired her. And in terms of writing, she also, just like mainstream literary fiction writers, wanted to, when she wanted to define her writing style, she studied the writer Park Wan-seok, whom many of you know. Yeah. I have another question that is addressed to both authors. So when you write a story, do you self-consciously think of, okay, I'm gonna write science fiction? For instance, the editors ask you to do that, or you are letting your imagination free and sci-fi and fantasy elements just enter into your work? Bora, shall we go with you first?
No. I consider myself as a horror writer, so unless I'm commissioned to write science fiction, I don't. I tend to write ghost stories. So yeah, when I've signed a contract, then there's no other way. But um, the only other time I'm spontaneously writing science fiction is after class. Goodbye, My Love was inspired during a class discussion. The actual title of my class is Finding Self Through Science Fiction. So we talk about existentialism, what is the self, how you define it, what is to be conscious, what is to find meaning in life, those kind of things. And one of the things we were discussing in that week was what it means to be unique, because your life is unique. You are unique, and what does that mean? And can a robot be unique? Can an AI sentient AI be unique the way human beings are unique? Those kind of things. And I wanted to write a story about a robot that thinks itself as unique but is not considered unique. And then because I like violence, I killed off the human protagonist. Yep. Thank you. Boyoung, please save me.
예, 예. 예, 다른 데서도 얘기했는데, 소설을 쓸 때는 가장 저 자신에게 충실해서 저의 내면으로 들어가서 그 안에서 자연스럽게 나오는 이야기를 쓰고자 하는데, 저는 언제나 그렇게 했을 때 판타지 아니면 SF가 나온다고 생각을 하고, 어쩌면 인간이 가장 자연스럽게 이야기를 만들어냈을 때 그게 환상소설의 형태가 되지 않을까 생각을 해요. 그래서 그게 남들이 보기에 SF이기도 하고 판타지이기도 하고 그런 듯합니다.
Okay, Boyoung is saying that she tries to just dive deep into her inner thoughts and feelings, and oftentimes those thoughts and feelings find their shape in language in the form of fantasy and SF. In fact, there is I think this year at the conference of American comparative literature, there was a critic who was arguing that fantasy is the expression of radical interiority. And she says, so she thinks also, just like the critic says, she thinks also it's a fantasy what she is writing, but it finds sometimes the best language in the science fiction genre. Okay, there's one more question, and I have my own question, but this will be the last question from the audience, I would say. So to Bora, so Bora, okay, so you write horror, sci-fi, whatever, but which Korean, but also Russian, Polish, Eastern European, that is outside the Anglo-Saxon world, writers would you credit for influencing your work? And are they also the writers that you translate into Korean?
Yeah, I love Andrei Platonov. I translated him, Bruno Schultz, Witold Gombrowicz, Witkadze. So Russian and Polish writers from the 1920s, 1930s. I translate them. I am influenced by them, and I am in love with them. Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, I didn't have the honor of translating her, but she is amazing. Everybody go read Petrushevskaya. You have to read Petrushevskaya. And Russian, like contemporary Russian women writers, they tend to be striking. They are something else. So yeah, I love Russian literature. I can go on and on forever.
Okay. My question for the writers and translators, if you have come across such a work, because of Sci-Fi, right? The popularity of Sci-Fi, the environmental issues, the Anthropocene. There have been also, I heard from the German fandom leader, the effort to put together solar punk or science fiction stories about environment, right? And there is an effort in America too. And I wonder, because from my own research, I see it more recent. I mean, which is why Bora just see the stood out. And also evolution myth deals with, it can be said, qualified. Are you seeing within Korea any trend to write about science environment within science or speculative fiction writers? Anyone? No? Boyoung? Are you serving as a reviewer of award? Have you seen those works?
영어 말씀하셔서 제가 정확하게 무슨 말씀이신지.
그러니까 환경 SF에 관한 관심이 많이 있는데요. 예를 들어서 최근에 뭐 제가 본 게 안전가옥에서 뭐 미세먼지라는 주제로 모아내기도 하고, 그래서 그 이제 SF 어워드 이런데 심사위원으로 하시면 그 환경 SF랑 관련된 작품들이 늘어나는 추세인가요?
사실 저는 SF들을 운영만 하고 심사를 안 해서 죄송합니다. 예, 그 경향성 모르겠지만 제 생각에는 AI와 마찬가지로 환경도 어떤 그 마이너한 이슈가 아니라 우리 현실에 직접적으로 와닿아 있는 이슈라서 예, 그냥 하루 동안 트위터만 들여다봐도 당장 기후 위기에 대한 뉴스가 일상적으로 볼 수 있습니다. 그런 환경에 대한 SF가 늘어난다고 해도 이상한 일은 아니고 그저 현실을 반영했을 때 자연스럽게 나올 수 있다고 생각을 해요.
So Boyoung is saying, just like AI, environmental issues are increasingly becoming public concerns, and just you look at the daily Twitters and you are bound to encounter a number of messages concerning the environment. So they are increasing, the environmental science fiction, speculative fiction works. And that's because just because of the trends within the material, the changes in the material reality. Okay, I think we can keep going. So go ahead. Go ahead, Bora.
So I recently reviewed, juried Post-Text Science Fiction Award, which is new. It just started last year. And I saw a lot of disaster or catastrophe science fiction. So not exactly environmental, but well, we're all screwed already. we jumped through the environmental part, and we're already facing that death and destruction. So I think that kind of mentality is quite prevalent among the beginning writers and the younger generation.
Yeah, it's true that in fact there has been in the Association of Asian Studies Conference a panel on apocalyptic science fiction from South Korea. That is that South Koreans tended to they have lived through war and the financial crisis before America did. So in their science fiction, the reality has already undergone apocalypse. And how do we survive in post-apocalyptic world is a major theme, has been such for years. And now it's continuing, especially among younger writers, who belong to the same generation of Koreans who are all investing in Bitcoin, and you see the headline news. Okay, so while we can keep going on, I think the time is up, and I would say that we will have other occasions. Science fiction, Kaya Press is going to bring the Duna's first story collection in the fall. And there will be 2 volumes by Duna, and also Kim Chang-gyu, the male writer. Collection is down in the pipeline as well. So please stay tuned and watch SF making its way into the mainstream Korean literature and culture. And now I want to thank you for coming, as well as the participants and organizers. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.